I mean, it's actually wild. Like, you go from being an Oyo princess to a slave in the kingdom of Dahomey. Your parents have been mauled, killed, your friends kidnapped, right? And then next thing you know, you're sold off to a white man by an African king. And then next thing you know, you're Queen Victoria's goddaughter. And she's taking care of you and your future daughter. It's actually wild. We look at Queen Victoria and people are taking down her statues in certain countries. Like, she is the queen mother of colonization throughout the world. She was the leader of the doomsday for most countries throughout the world, where the British came in and snatched everything up. She is the Kickstarter of that era. But like a woman like Sara is going to look at her in a different light than a lot of us. For some reason, she was really invested in making Sara live the best life, very proper. Like, is it heroic? Is it sad? Was Sara like that token little black girl for her? Can I hate on that? You know what I'm saying? Like, is this like a white man's burden type situation? A white woman's burden? Or is this like a good example of the philanthropy that Queen Victoria was trying to do? It's really complex. Hello, and welcome to Blacked Out History, where we talk about all things black as hell in history that are not in our textbooks. They're not on a lot of our televisions. This is rapidly changing, and I am here to accommodate that segue into African history being mainstream history. If you are into history, if you are into me, if you are into vibes, if you are into learning, please make sure that you like this video before you start watching it. Go ahead and like it. So let's just dive straight into it today. So Sarah Forbes Bonetta, as she would later become known, was born on 1843. Her real name was Amoba Ina, which literally means like Princess Ina. So no one knows the exact day that she was born in 1843, but we do know that she was born into the Goddaughter clan, which is like a part of the Yoruba people of the Oyo Empire, right? So if you guys watched my last episode on the Dahomeys and the women warriors of the kingdom of Dahomey, you might remember the Oyo Empire. So the Oyo Empire, that's what the movie's completely based off of. The Woman King is how they took over and like fought the Oyo Empire and all that. I'm going to put the link right here so you guys can watch that video and catch up if you haven't. But anyway, so Sarah's parents lived in the Oyo Empire in Oke-Odon, which was a city in that empire, and they lived there their entire lives. But in 1848, the city was actually attacked by the Dahomeys, and most of the people who lived in the city were held captive or killed. So unfortunately, Sara, her parents ended up being in the group of people that got killed. And Sara ended up becoming a young slave under the Dahomey Empire. So meanwhile, the year is 1850, and a Royal Navy captain, Frederick E. Forbes, arrives in West Africa. So he actually came to West Africa in the hopes of negotiating with King Gezo of the Dahomey kingdom and convincing him to end the slave trade. Yes, a white man did trek to Africa to convince an African king to end the slave trade. So these type of discussions usually were made with really like big ceremonies, and the king would try to like make friends with a lot of the British who arrived and like make them feel welcomed. So they did have a ceremony that started off just like very normally. The king's offering Captain Forbes like an array of nice gifts, like a footstool, some kente cloth, a keg of rum, some like fancy shells. And then out the woodworks, he kind of presented the captain with a very odd gift, Amoba Aina, the girl. So she was assumed to have been a part of a very prestigious family in the Oyo Empire, or the king would have mostly like sold her with the rest of the future slaves to like a slave buyer, but he kind of kept her around. She lived in Dahomey for about 2 years before the king gave her away to the captain. So I'm sure when the captain like got her as a gift, he was just sitting there like, I came here to tell you to stop selling slaves, and here you are gifting me a slave. But the king did let him know that the gift ultimately was for Queen Victoria. In his journal, the captain wrote that he knew that refusing Ina would probably lead to her being seen as like useless, and she would either be killed in like a religious sacrifice or sold into slavery. So even though he wasn't really like feeling the vibe all the way and did not want to take Ina as a slave, he went ahead and took her anyway because he just didn't want like anything bad to her to like happen and it be his fault. So he decided that the name Ina just wasn't simple enough for him, and he wanted her to have like a normal name. He renamed her Sarah Forbes Bonetta. His last name was obviously Forbes, and Bonetta was the name of his ship that he had came down to West Africa on. So simple, Sarah Forbes Bonetta. He took her to a church, got her baptized. He initially intended on raising Sarah as his own because he didn't think that the queen would be like very pleased to have her, and like showing up with an entire human is kind of a lot on anybody, especially when the queen sent you there specifically to say stop selling humans. But Queen Victoria herself was an actually very interesting woman, to say the least. So I could see why he was kind of like, in 1837, when her uncle, who was king at the time, William the Ninth, died, she was crowned Queen of England at only 18. She was a very well-cultured woman. She spoke German, Latin, French, Italian, English. She would even later go on to learn Hindu because of all of the Indian slaves who she stole from India when Britain was colonizing India and the British Tea Company and all that. So her husband, Prince Albert, was actually German, and she is actually the one who proposed to him. Not to mention that he also was her first cousin. So literally, I just can't, like, the woman was weird, the situation was weird. She actually survived, fun fact, she survived 3 assassination attempts on her life. And she really is one of England's most like controversial but longest lasting reigns throughout British history. So she's literally the one person that we can kind of blame for British colonization of the entire world, because it really started under her reign, right? And it's affected the world negatively ever since. And this is going to be poor Sarah's future godmom. Anyway, so Sarah went to go live with the captain at his home with his wife, and she stayed there for a couple of she stayed there for a couple of months before she actually went to go meet the queen. But once she did meet the queen was really impressed with Sarah, and she noticed that Sarah was extremely intelligent, which she was probably very surprised, just like with the stigmas of what Africans were. So she took Sarah under her wing, and for some reason like nicknamed her Sally. So sometimes you'll see her referred to as Sally or Sarah. So at this time it was really rare for white like aristocrats to have relationships with Africans outside of labor or them being like a servant. But the queen had also just really like loved her as a person, which you can see in a lot of the journals that she writes in regards to Sarah and their relationship in the future. So she started to like kind of mold Sarah from an early age. Her goal was to like turn Sarah into this fine African British woman, right? Show that colonization was worth it and everything was going right. She admired Sarah so much that she actually called on a celebrity royal photographer and had so many photos of Sara taken when she first arrives, and she had them put into the royal archives of Britain as well. So she raised Sara outside of her actual palace. Sara did not move into Buckingham Palace with Queen Victoria. Victoria had her own kids. She had 9 kids and a husband who she loved very much. But like, I can understand that. No woman is going to just like take on all these kids. You already have 9. So she was cool with Forbes kind of like keeping Sara and raising her for that moment. Forbes wrote, for her age of only 8 years, she is a perfect genius. She now speaks English well and has a great talent for music. She has won the affections, with but few exceptions, of all who have known her. She is far in advance of any white child of her age in aptness of learning and strength of mind and affection. That is really, really sweet, I think. So Sara would visit the queen and the queen's children at Windsor Palace pretty often, but like I said, she never moved in. Her and the queen's youngest daughter, Princess Alice, were really, really close growing up. And they were the exact same age. So there was like a lot of the things that Alice did, Sara would also do. And the queen would make sure that Sara had access to those things as well. So eventually Sara would leave the Forbes to be raised by a different family. I don't know exactly why the queen had requested this, but it was what it was. The queen continued to nurture her. Sara was really interested in like literature, art, music. She sponsored all of Sara's lessons, took care of her like basic needs, made sure that she was very well dressed. It was giving like English colonizer slash fairy godmother at this point. It's like a toxic love relationship. I don't really know. But in 1851, Sara began to like develop a really bad cough. Her body was just not used to being in the Caucasus region where like it's cold. You know, she had grown up in Africa. West Africa, as we all know, is very humid, warm as hell. And the queen just kind of started getting like a feeling to send her back to Africa for education, and only for a short amount of time, right? She kind of wanted Sara to like grow culturally aware of where she came from and just provide her that experience to like be able to self-identify. So off Sara went to Annie Walsh Memorial School, which was actually located in Freetown, Sierra Leone. This was one of the best missionary schools in West Africa at the time. They were really, really appreciative to the king for bringing Sara there in the first place, because they could kind of boast, like, you know, like this is where the queen's goddaughter was sent. She's African, like, look, right? So it gave Sara the opportunity to become very educated. On the school registrar list, her name actually appears as Sally Bonetta. The queen made sure that Sara was often sent like the best textbooks, the best toys, the best games, the best clothes. She just made sure that her life was set, whether she lived in England or not. So Sara didn't really feel Sierra Leone in the way that she thought she would. And she started writing the queen and letting the queen know that she was actually really not happy there. Queen Victoria tried her hardest to kind of like, it's okay, Sara, like just stick it out, stick it out. But eventually she gave in and just told Sara, okay, girl, like just come on back to England. So Sara only went to the school for 4 years. She stayed there until she was 12. And then the queen decided that it was best to send for Sara, and she came back to England. So she lived with a new group of family. This time the queen had her with a British couple who was a part of the royal court, Mr. and Mrs. Shawn, and she lived in Chatham, which was like a suburban area. So everyone in Sara's life, like I said, was really just like impressed with her. She outshined like many of her tutors. Victoria recorded in her own journal that she saw Sally Forbes, the Negro girl who I have educated. She is immensely grown and has a lovely figure. It was great seeing her again. So the people around her just started noticing that she had like a really natural ability to pick up on things like the black girl magic going on. Nothing much better. So Sara was really like a gem in society, and the queen invited her to a lot of her prestigious events, including the queen's daughter, one of her eldest daughters, Princess Victoria, who was named after the queen. So she was able to attend Victoria's wedding, which was full of like very prestigious people throughout Europe. And eventually, when Princess Alice got married, she also attended Princess Alice's wedding to Prince Louis. So this was when the pressure began to get worse for Sara, and the queen kind of started looking at her like, it's time for you to get married. So Sara did get proposed to at the age of 18 by a 31-year-old British Nigerian businessman named James Pinson Labulo Davies. So he was considered to be like really wealthy at this time, and he had built a pretty amazing life for himself in England. He was really accomplished, like doing his own thing, like sexy bachelor vibes. He was a merchant sailor. He used to be in the Navy as an officer. He was in the British Navy. He owned many farms throughout West Africa. He had created like many different like innovative industrial gadgets that were used throughout Europe. And he just like was credited for a lot of things. He actually can be credited as being one of the people who introduced pioneer cocoa farming to West Africa in the first place, after he stole some cocoa seeds from a Brazilian ship and planted it in West Africa. So he was actually born in Sierra Leone, even though he was Nigerian. His parents were Nigerian. He was born in Sierra Leone and was a part of the Creole tribe of Sierra Leone. So initially he was married to a Spanish lady from Havana named Matilda Serrano, but she died about 9 months after their marriage. And he's obviously like looking around for a new wife. He's 31, Sara's 18. He was like feeling the vibe. This is a classy chick. He's into it. So Sara wasn't really into it. She wrote a letter to one of her guardians saying, "Others would say he is a good man, and though you don't care about him now, you will soon learn to love him. That, I believe, I never could do. I know that the generality of people would say he is rich, and you marrying him would at once make you independent. And I say I am to barter my peace of mind for money? No, never." So Sara just was not into it. She just wasn't into it. She seems like a pretty logical woman. The queen was really happy to hear that he wanted to marry Sara, and she really didn't care what Sara had to say. She was more concerned of just making sure that she did not like waste her investment in making Sara super educated on like some loser, some like African loser in the street. You know, like she wanted Sara to end up with someone who could provide for her the lifestyle that the queen had provided her whole life. And she just wanted Sara to be with someone who was high in society, right? Obviously, during this time, there's not really like that many African options in Britain. Like, of course, there were a lot of Africans, but not on that level that the queen wanted as far as Sara's dating pool. So obviously, they weren't gonna like encourage her either to go find like a white man, or like, you know, that the queen really wanted her to be with an African. So when Sara rejected the proposal, the queen actually got very pissed off. Sara did not love him. She did not feel the vibe, but the queen just didn't really care. Like, that's where that, like, I did this, so you do this comes in. Like, nothing's free, right? There's nothing such as a free lunch. And I told you that here. So, since Sara was being hard headed and not agreeing to marry who the queen wanted her to, the queen basically sent her away to live in the ghetto. Like, off this into this slum town at somebody's house. Like, she wanted to kind of like wake Sara up, like show her what it was to live a rough life, like kind of make her realize like, hey, I'm not going to be doing this for you forever. Like, if you want to keep maintaining your life, you need to marry this Nigerian man, Sara, basically. So eventually the queen literally forced her to marry James in August of 1862. And It was what it was. So they got married at St. Nicholas Church in Brighton, England. And they had a very diverse and lavish wedding. Like, this was for the books. They had 10 carriages, like the finest silks and setups, cakes, luxuries. Their wedding parties were made up of white ladies who walked with African gentlemen, African ladies who were walking with white gentlemen. She had 16 bridesmaids in total. Like, it was a beautiful wedding. Their marriage was all over the newspaper. They were like that token black couple of excellence that Britain kind of wanted to like push out, right? They were publicized as being like the fantasy, almost the fairy tale for, hey, civilizing Africans here does work. Look at what we did. Look, when we took them from Africa, this is it, right? So they were quoted in a newspaper as being the wedding of two angelized, wealthy, well-connected Africans, and proof of the successes that philanthropists and the missionary have had over the prejudices of pride and blood. The queen paid for her wedding and made sure that she literally had a wedding for a princess. It was said to have been just as nice as the ones that she threw for her own daughters, her flesh and blood. So what's interesting is Sara signed her wedding certificate with her Yoruba name, Aina, and not Sarah, Sally, Forbes, none of that. She signed Aina. So in my mind, I'm like, was she missing home? Was she feeling like regretful she didn't get to have a traditional wedding? I don't know. There's not many records on her thoughts as far as assimilating into British culture, but that's history for you, you know? So we don't really have her viewpoint on that many things, but it was what it was. So after the wedding, they actually moved back to Africa together. They settled down in Lagos, Nigeria, where her husband had been offered like a really good business opportunity, and they just began their life there. Her husband was very affluent and well known in Lagos, so everything was easy peasy. She continued living a great life even outside of England, and her husband made sure of it. So her husband would eventually become a part of the Legislative Council in Lagos. She got pregnant pretty quickly after their wedding, and they had a beautiful little girl, right? So she had to write and ask the queen if it was okay for her to name her little girl Victoria after the queen. So when the queen gets this letter, she's like so delighted, like, oh my God, my little black, like, God grandbaby. Like, she obviously agreed for the baby's name to be Victoria, and she also requested that she become Victoria's official godmom. So at this point, Queen Victoria, can you adopt my black ass too? Like, she's just adopting everybody, right? So who would not want a rich godmom? Sara actually took her daughter to visit the queen in England for the first time in 1867. And at this point, Sara was 24 years old. She stayed with the queen for 2 months and then returned back to Lagos. So the queen really loved baby Victoria, if not more than she had loved Sara. Like, she loved her some baby Victoria. The queen gifted her golden spoons, golden knives, golden cups, sent her home with the finest fabrics. Like, she just made sure that everything that baby Victoria touched was great. So she would also get like a lot of news and progress reports on Victoria. And when she found out that Victoria later in her life had been taking music lessons as a child at her school, on the day that Victoria passed the music examination, the queen actually ordained that that day become a holiday, and that school like shut down the school to celebrate this little girl passing her exam. Like, her godmom was just so proud of her. Like, if I was a student there, I'd be like, what the like, but whatever. A holiday is a holiday. So Sara did have two other children. She had her son Arthur in 1871 and a little girl named Stella in 1873, but they were not really as like loved and adored by the queen as much as baby Victoria. So throughout her life, Sara really was still struggling with those issues with like pneumonia and her respiratory system as far as traveling in between England and West Africa. She always had just like this lingering cough and illness that would not go away. So in 1880, she suffered from tuberculosis, and it was especially bad for her as compared to other people because she just always had like immune problems and she was already really compromised. So she was sent to Madeira and Portugal to get better and get like better medical attention than she would be able to get in Lagos. But she did die in 1880. She was about like in her late 30s, almost 40. She died there. So this poor guy, her husband James, just can't catch a break at this point. Like all his wives are dying every time. And it just really broke James's heart, like left her kids without a mother. She found out about the news when she was actually on the way to England to visit Queen Victoria. She found out about it from Queen Victoria, and Queen Victoria had to be the one to tell her, which was really sad. So Queen Victoria wrote in her journal, I see now that Sally is dead, and I feel bad for her dear little child, far blacker than herself, called Victoria, a lively, intelligent child with big, melancholy eyes. Deaf just as she was traveling to Osborne to visit me. I am now having to report this to my black godchild, who was dreadfully upset and distressed. Her father has failed in business, which aggravated her poor mother's illness. I shall give her an annuity, period. So Victoria was given a yearly stipend every year from that point on from the royal court, and she visited the Queen's royal household in England a lot throughout her life without her other two siblings. Everything that the Queen had done for Sara, she did for Victoria and more. Like she made sure that Victoria was betrothed to a rich man as well, literally. Like this is Sara all over again. So she got married to a rich African man who had been educated in Britain, and the Queen also paid for Victoria, baby Victoria's wedding in England. So this wedding was just as top notch as Sara's had been, and she made sure that she was there to kind of like play that mother role to Victoria during that wedding by helping her pick out her dress and all these things. So Victoria did go on to have kids and live happily ever after. One of her daughters was actually named after her as well and chosen to be a godmother by Princess Beatrice, who is one of Queen Victoria's daughters. So it's really interesting that the Queen took a great liking to Sara, but it's ultimately really sad to think about the treatment that they got compared to other Africans who were living around them. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I wonder what that looks for someone to see if you're an African servant or like you're just an average like British African on the street and you see this girl just like living her best life. And it's kind of confusing because at this time, Victoria was also rapidly colonizing many African countries, many Indian countries, Caribbean countries. I think she had just seized like Australia, Canada, like she was growing her dominion all over the world and ruining so many people's lives and oppressing others. But at the same time, this was like a little pet project for her. So it's kind of like interesting. Like I always wonder what she saw in Sara that she didn't see in others during the dehumanization process of colonization. So Sara's picture actually lives in the National Portrait Gallery in London today. It is an original photo of her wedding picture, her in her wedding dress, standing by herself. Her husband is not in it. And this picture has actually been repainted and recently hung up in a Black History like showcase in London because London celebrates Black History Month every October. So it's just pretty interesting. I don't know if I would count this as sad or happy. Like I'm happy for her, for Sara and her daughter Victoria, because I mean that's a chill plug, you know, like you don't know what could have really happened to Sara if she had not been taken as a gift to Queen Victoria. We don't know what type of life Sara would have lived. So it did grant her access to like a very successful African man, but who can say she would have gotten that if she stayed in Dahomey and all these things. So it's all very interesting, you guys. I would love to know your opinion on this. Is this a charity case? Is it embarrassing? Is it sad? Like, it's just so sticky. Honestly, history is very, very sticky. But like and comment below. Let me know if I missed out on any information or any fun facts that you may have. Do we know any other queens around the world who adopted a random minority girl? Like, I don't know, you guys. Talk to me nice. Make sure you like this video. Make sure you subscribe.